The 20-year-old soldier is clutching the right side of his swollen stomach, sweating profusely, and breathing in short, shallow gasps as if an invisible belt is crushing his lungs. When the camp surgeon orders the boy onto a canvas stretcher and gently presses a hand against the upper right side of his abdomen, the prisoner lets out a sudden, blood-curdling scream of absolute agony. The muscles in his stomach are rigid as a wooden board, indicating a catastrophic internal disaster that has been silently building for weeks. When the translator is rushed into the room to explain that a hidden piece of metal is physically slicing his liver apart, and he is bleeding to death internally, the terrified teenager completely falls apart. The scene begins on a sweltering afternoon at a massive United States prisoner of war intake facility in the American Midwest. Thousands of captured German soldiers are shuffling through the high security gates, exhausted from a grueling ocean, crossing and waiting to be processed into their designated wooden barracks. In the middle of the crowded courtyard, a 20-year-old infantryman named Elias is trying desperately to keep himself upright by leaning heavily against the shoulder of an older soldier. The American guards patrolling the line instantly spot him, because the whites of his eyes and the skin of his face have taken on a bizarre, jaundiced yellow tint. Elias is gripping the lower right side of his ribcage with both hands, protecting a swollen, heavy mass that he has been hiding for over a month. The guards do not wait for the standard medical screening to begin. They immediately pull the stumbling teenager out of the dusty column and support his dead weight as they drag him toward the bright white canvas of the main camp hospital tent. Elias tries to resist, absolutely terrified by the enemy doctors, but his body has completely run out of the necessary blood volume to fight back. He collapses onto the canvas stretcher, his terrifying medical secret finally exposed to the bright lights of the American medical staff. We are at the intake gates of an American prisoner of war camp. Now, we must go back 2 months to a shattered European city to understand how the tiny piece of metal entered his body. 2 months before his arrival in the United States, Elias was fighting a desperate, losing battle in the rubble-filled streets of a heavily bombed German industrial city. The Allied artillery barrages were relentless, sending explosive shells crashing through the remaining brick walls and turning the urban landscape into a terrifying maze of flying concrete and steel. During a frantic retreat across a ruined courtyard, a mortar shell detonated against a stone fountain less than 40 feet from his position. The explosion threw Elias violently against a brick wall, and he felt a sharp, sudden sting on the right side of his abdomen, just below the edge of his ribs. He managed to crawl behind a collapsed bakery, checking his uniform for the massive, gaping wound he expected to find. Instead, he found only a tiny, bleeding puncture hole the size of a small coin, looking more like a simple bee sting than a catastrophic combat injury. What he did not know was that a microscopic, razor-sharp sliver of rusted steel had bypassed his rib bones entirely and buried itself deep inside his abdominal cavity. The metal fragment came to rest directly against the delicate, highly vascular capsule of his liver, sitting perfectly still like a hidden landmine. We are in the rubble of a European city. Next, we will watch the false healing process that convinces the young soldier he is perfectly safe. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? If you want to dive even deeper into these untold stories, consider becoming a channel member. You'll get your name mentioned in the video, early access to videos, exclusive content, and direct input on which stories we cover next. Join our inner circle of history keepers. The unit medic checked the small puncture wound later that evening under the dim light of a kerosene lantern in a dark cellar. The medic saw no active arterial bleeding, wiped the dirt away with a piece of rough cotton, and applied a tight field bandage over the small hole. Because Elias was still walking and talking perfectly fine, the medic classified it as a minor superficial flesh wound and ordered him right back to the defensive line. The human body is remarkably efficient at closing surface wounds, and within a week, a thick, hard scab had completely sealed the tiny puncture shut. Elias returned to the grueling physical demands of the urban combat, carrying heavy ammunition crates and digging defensive trenches in the freezing mud. But every time he bent over or lifted a heavy object, the tight abdominal muscles compressed his internal organs, pushing his liver directly against the jagged piece of stationary shrapnel. The microscopic razor blade began to slowly slice microscopic cuts into the surface of the liver tissue, completely unnoticed beneath the healed skin. The false safety of the scab masked the fact that a slow, lethal internal hemorrhage had just officially begun. We are on the collapsing front lines in Europe. Now, we follow him to the moment of his capture, where the physical exertion begins to violently move the shrapnel. The brutal urban defense finally collapsed when an American armored division completely surrounded the remaining German infantry units in a ruined town square. The surviving German officers ordered an immediate mass surrender, and the exhausted teenagers threw their heavy rifles onto the cobblestones and raised their hands high into the air. As Elias stretched his arms toward the sky, the sudden, extreme extension of his abdominal cavity pulled the liver tissue violently across the sharp edge of the rusted steel. He felt a deep, sickening tear inside his right side, followed instantly by a dull, throbbing ache that radiated all the way up into his right shoulder. He gasped for air and stumbled forward, instinctively wrapping his arms around his waist as the American infantrymen moved through the lines to search the prisoners. The German military propaganda machine had deeply brainwashed the young recruits, insisting that the American military immediately executed any prisoner who required extensive hospital care. Driven by this absolute terror, Elias forced himself to stand perfectly straight, biting the inside of his cheek to hide the sudden, nauseating pain radiating from his core. He survived the initial capture by remaining entirely invisible, but the deep laceration inside his liver had just opened a steady flow of dark venous blood. We are at the muddy surrender point. Next, we move to the brutal train transport, where the internal bleeding truly begins to show its terrifying symptoms. The captured men were forced onto crowded transport trains, packed tightly into wooden boxcars for the long, agonizing journey to the coastal shipping port. The conditions inside the train were horrific, with 60 men crammed into a space designed for half that number, leaving absolutely no room to sit or lie down. The violent, constant swaying and jolting of the train cars slammed Elias against the wooden walls, causing the metal shard to grind relentlessly against the lacerated organ. The steady leak of dark blood began to pool heavily in the lowest part of his abdominal cavity, irritating the sensitive lining of his stomach and intestines. By the third day of the train ride, Elias noticed that the waistband of his uniform trousers had become incredibly tight, despite the fact that he was actively starving. His abdomen was slowly expanding as liters of free blood accumulated inside the closed space, pushing his other internal organs out of their natural positions. He developed a constant, low-grade fever and a terrible, gripping nausea that prevented him from eating the small rations provided by the guards. He spent the train ride leaning against the wooden corner, completely terrified of the growing, heavy mass sloshing around inside his own belly. We are inside a suffocating European boxcar. Now we transition to the dark ocean crossing, where his body begins to completely shut down. The prisoners were eventually herded out of the trains and directly into the deep, dark cargo holds of massive transport ships bound for the United States. In the cramped, multi-tiered canvas bunks, Elias finally had the chance to lie down, but the relief was completely overshadowed by the raging disaster inside his abdomen. The continuous, rolling motion of the Atlantic Ocean waves acted as a mechanical grinder, rubbing the jagged shrapnel against the liver capsule with every single swell. The liver, overwhelmed by the physical trauma and the massive amount of reabsorbed blood, slowly began to fail in its duty to filter toxins from his body. A waste product called bilirubin began to rapidly accumulate in his bloodstream, traveling through his circulatory system and depositing a thick, dark pigment into his tissues. Over the course of the 2-week ocean crossing, the whites of his eyes and the pale skin of his face turned a vibrant, sickly shade of yellow. The classic, undeniable symptom of severe jaundice made him look like a terrifying, jaundiced ghost haunting the dark corner of the cargo hold. The other German prisoners quietly moved their bunks away from him, assuming he had contracted a highly contagious and lethal strain of infectious hepatitis. We are deep in the hull of a transport ship crossing the Atlantic. Next, we arrive back on American soil, bringing us directly to the moment his disguise fails. This brings us right back to the moment the transport train deposits the prisoners into the dusty courtyard of the massive American camp in the Midwest. Elias steps off the train car, but the sheer weight of the pooled blood in his rigid, distended abdomen completely throws off his center of gravity. He is carrying nearly 2 liters of free fluid inside his stomach cavity, creating an immense, suffocating pressure against his diaphragm that makes drawing a full breath entirely impossible. The bright sunlight makes the shocking, fluorescent yellow tint of his skin impossible to hide from the experienced American military guards patrolling the intake line. When a guard steps forward and orders him to drop his heavy canvas bag, the sudden twisting motion causes the shrapnel to slice a fresh, deep groove into the liver tissue. Elias lets out a sharp, breathless gasp, dropping the bag into the dirt and collapsing heavily to his knees, clutching his right side with trembling hands. 2 guards immediately grab him by the shoulders, completely bypassing the standard intake procedures and dragging his dead weight directly toward the main medical facility. His desperate, agonizing disguise has finally collapsed entirely, leaving him completely at the mercy of the enemy medical staff he fears more than death. We are in the dusty yard of an American camp. Now we step inside the medical tent where the surgeon confronts the solid, swollen abdomen. Inside the brightly lit medical tent, the head American trauma surgeon takes one look at the yellow, shivering boy on the canvas stretcher and orders his uniform cut away immediately. The heavy trauma shears slice through the wool fabric, exposing a swollen, tightly stretched abdomen that is covered in deep, terrifying shades of bruised purple and dark blue. The surgeon does not need a complex blood test to recognize the classic, unmistakable signs of a massive, life-threatening internal hemorrhage pooling inside the peritoneal cavity. The yellow jaundice confirms that the liver or the biliary tract has sustained catastrophic, blunt force damage that is actively poisoning the boy's entire system. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? We would love to know who is keeping these stories alive. The surgeon steps forward, places 2 fingers gently against the upper right quadrant of the boy's stomach, and presses down to check for internal guarding. The moment the doctor applies pressure, the abdominal muscles reflexively lock into a rigid, wooden board, and Elias lets out a blood-curdling scream of pure, unfiltered agony. The pain is so severe that it sends the boy into immediate physiological shock, his eyes rolling back in his head as his blood pressure drops dangerously low. The surgeon shouts for the nurses to prepare the emergency operating room immediately, knowing that the boy is only hours away from a fatal cardiovascular collapse. We are inside the initial examination room. Next, we move to the diagnostic X-ray that reveals the invisible killer hiding in his organs. Before making a massive surgical incision, the surgeon orders the orderlies to rush the fading teenager into the camp's small, humming X-ray room to locate the source of the bleeding. Elias is lifted onto the cold metal plate, completely paralyzed by the pain, staring at the mechanical camera above him with wide, terrified yellow eyes. The heavy machine clicks loudly, sending a quick burst of radiation through his swollen abdomen to capture a shadowy image of his internal organs on a glass plate. The surgeon pulls the wet film out of the chemical developing bath a few minutes later, clips it to a glowing light box, and stares in absolute shock. Resting squarely inside the dark, dense shadow of the right liver lobe is a massive, jagged, twisted piece of artillery shrapnel shaped like a rusted arrowhead. The doctor traces the faint, healed scar on the boy's skin and realizes that the metal bypassed the ribs completely and has been sitting inside him for months. The constant physical exertion of the march and the transport ships has allowed the jagged metal to actively carve the liver to pieces from the inside out. The doctor realizes that if he does not open the abdomen and pull the metal out today, the boy will bleed to death in his sleep. We are in the dark developing room looking at the film. Now we return to the examination table where the terrifying truth must be translated. The head surgeon calls for the camp translator, a bilingual German prisoner who assists the medical staff, to urgently explain the dire medical situation to the panicking boy. Elias is breathing in short, rapid gasps, entirely convinced that the American doctor is preparing to execute him for bringing a lethal, contagious disease into the clean camp. The translator steps up to the edge of the examination table, speaking in a very calm, slow, and measured German voice to cut through the blinding panic. He points to the right side of his own stomach and tells Elias clearly that his liver is actively rupturing, because a hidden piece of metal is slicing it apart. The translator warns Elias that the massive swelling is his own blood, and that the American surgeons must put him to sleep and cut his stomach open to stop the bleeding immediately. For 3 long seconds, Elias just stares at the translator, his damaged brain fighting to process the unbelievable truth that the enemy wants to perform a highly complex, life-saving surgery. Then, the absolute finality of the diagnosis crashes into his chest, and the heavy psychological dam of propaganda he has maintained for 2 months completely shatters. He breaks down into a state of pure, hysterical weeping, crying from the overwhelming, crushing realization of the absolute mercy being shown to him by the enemy. He nods slowly, wiping his dirty, yellow face with his sleeve, and whispers his permission to let the doctors cut him open. We are watching a young man break down in an American hospital tent. Next, we step back to look at the massive medical reality of liver trauma during the war. To truly grasp the absolute miracle of Elias surviving the ocean crossing, we have to look at the grim numbers surrounding abdominal trauma during the 1940 era. Before the widespread availability of advanced surgical techniques and massive blood transfusions, penetrating wounds to the abdomen carried a staggering mortality rate exceeding 60%. When a piece of shrapnel enters the abdominal cavity, it introduces highly aggressive bacteria from the dirt while simultaneously shredding the highly vascular internal organs. The liver is an incredibly dense, blood-rich organ that filters nearly 1.5 liters of blood every single minute to maintain human life. A severe rupture or deep laceration to the liver means that a patient can completely bleed to death internally in a matter of hours without ever showing a drop of blood on their skin. The fact that the tiny entry wound scabbed over, trapping the bleeding inside the cavity, ironically prevented a massive external hemorrhage but created a deadly internal pressure cooker. Elias survived for 2 months entirely because the liver capsule managed to temporarily contain the bleeding, slowly leaking blood, instead of catastrophically bursting open all at once. The American surgeon knew that opening the pressurized cavity was going to be an incredibly dangerous, bloody race against time to find the source. We are looking at the grim statistics of battlefield surgery. Now we enter the bright operating theater where the surgeon races against the clock. Elias is wheeled into the sterile, brightly lit operating room, his filthy uniform completely stripped away and replaced by a clean white hospital sheet. The anesthesiologist places a black rubber mask over his nose and mouth, instructing him through the translator to breathe deeply and count backward from 10. The sweet, heavy, chemical smell of ether fills his lungs, and the agonizing, crushing pressure in his abdomen fades away as he drops into a deep, dreamless darkness. The head surgeon steps up to the table, meticulously painting the massive, purple bruised, yellow skin of the boy's stomach with a dark orange iodine solution. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. The surgeon takes a sharp, sterile scalpel and makes a long, precise vertical incision straight down the center of the boy's abdomen, right past the navel. The moment the blade slices through the thick layers of abdominal muscle and opens the peritoneum, the immense, terrifying pressure inside the cavity is finally released. A massive, dark red wave of old, pooled blood immediately rushes out of the incision, spilling over the surgical drapes and pooling on the operating room floor. The surgeon shouts for the nurses to turn the heavy suction machines on to maximum power, desperately fighting to clear the visual field so he can find the damaged liver. We are in the operating room watching the first cut. Next, we witness the terrifying moment the pressurized blood is finally released and the organ is exposed. With the powerful suction machines roaring loudly in the background, the surgeon carefully uses heavy metal retractors to pull the abdominal muscles wide open. He navigates his gloved hands through the slippery, delicate loops of the intestines, pushing them gently aside to reach the upper right quadrant of the cavity. When he finally exposes the right lobe of the liver, he finds an organ that is severely swollen, dark, and covered in thick, fibrous scar tissue from weeks of ongoing trauma. Running directly across the front of the liver is a deep, jagged, bleeding laceration, exactly where the X-ray had shown the shadow hiding. The surgeon reaches deep into the bleeding laceration with a pair of long, heavy silver forceps, feeling the distinctive, hard scrape of metal against metal. He grips the object tightly, twists it carefully to avoid tearing any more vital tissue, and slowly pulls a rusted, jagged piece of steel artillery shrapnel out into the bright surgical lights. He drops the heavy metal shard into a tin basin with a loud, dull clank, completely removing the invisible razor that had been torturing the boy for 2 solid months. But removing the metal causes the deep laceration to bleed far more aggressively, forcing the surgeon into a frantic battle to seal the damaged organ. We are deep inside the surgical cavity of a dying boy. Now we watch the delicate, high-tension process of repairing the torn organ. Repairing a severely damaged liver is entirely different from fixing a torn muscle or a broken bone, because liver tissue is incredibly soft and fragile, resembling a dense, blood-soaked sponge. If a surgeon attempts to tightly stitch a deep liver laceration with standard surgical thread, the heavy string will simply tear right through the soft tissue like a wire cutting through cheese. To stop the massive bleeding, the American surgeon utilizes a highly effective technique developed specifically for complex abdominal trauma during the global conflict. He uses heavy, absorbable gelatin sponges and thick layers of sterile cotton gauze to manually pack the deep crater, applying constant, intense physical pressure to the bleeding vessels. He then generously pours massive amounts of white, crystalline sulfa powder directly onto the liver tissue to actively destroy any microscopic bacteria introduced by the rusted shrapnel. The combination of the heavy packing pressure and the advanced antibacterial powder slowly forces the liver to clot, effectively sealing the massive, weeping laceration shut. The surgeon carefully washes the entire abdominal cavity with liters of warm, sterile saline, removing the remaining old blood, and slowly stitches the boy's stomach securely closed. He steps back from the operating table, completely exhausted, knowing that the surgical intervention was successful, but the boy's liver still faces a massive recovery battle. We are watching the successful conclusion of an impossible surgery. Next, we follow the young prisoner into the quiet recovery ward where he wakes up. Elias is moved to a clean, isolated cot in the intensive recovery ward, his stomach heavily bandaged and tightly wrapped in thick white cotton binders. When he finally opens his eyes the next morning, the crushing, suffocating heat of the internal bleeding and the terrifying abdominal pressure are completely gone. He feels a sharp, clean, burning pain along the center of his stomach from the surgical incision, but it is entirely different from the heavy, sickening ache of a rupturing organ. He looks down toward the side of his bed and sees a thick rubber drainage tube extending from his bandages into a large glass bottle sitting on the floor. The tube is carefully draining the excess fluid and old blood from his healing abdominal cavity, ensuring that the deadly pressure does not build up a second time. A female American nurse walks quietly by his bed, checks the volume in the glass bottle, and offers him a small cup of clear, cold water. Elias drinks the water greedily, tears silently welling up in his yellow eyes as he processes the absolute miracle of his survival. He realizes that the enemy doctors did not just save his life. They spent hours meticulously rebuilding his broken body while he slept. We are in the clean recovery ward. Now we observe the slow, steady process of his body clearing the toxins over the next few weeks. The physical recovery process for massive liver trauma is incredibly slow, requiring weeks of strict bed rest and a highly specialized, protein-rich diet to help the organ regenerate. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, the resilient liver tissue slowly begins to heal, resuming its vital function of filtering toxins out of the boy's bloodstream. Elias watches in absolute fascination as the vibrant, terrifying yellow tint slowly fades from the whites of his eyes and recedes from the skin of his face. His natural, healthy color completely returns, proving that the terrible ghost of the jaundice has been entirely banished by the American surgical intervention. The nurses change his heavy abdominal dressings daily, treating him with a gentle, professional dignity that deeply shames him for ever believing the terrifying military propaganda. He spends hours talking with the camp translator, asking countless questions about the advanced surgical techniques and the white powders the Americans used to save him. The hospital tent becomes his entire universe, a strange, peaceful sanctuary where the brutal global war feels millions of miles away, and his worst fears were proven completely false. He realizes that the real poison he carried into that camp was not just the broken liver, but the toxic, fabricated lies planted in his head by his own army. We are observing the physical and mental healing of a prisoner of war. Next, we see his discharge and return to the general camp population. After nearly 2 months of intense rehabilitation in the hospital ward, Elias is finally officially discharged and assigned to a standard wooden barracks with his captured unit. He walks out of the hospital tent and into the bright, dusty camp yard, moving with a slight, protective stoop to avoid stretching his healing abdominal muscles. His fellow German soldiers stop what they are doing and stare at him in absolute, stunned disbelief, having fully assumed that the yellow, dying boy had been buried weeks ago. He no longer looks like a sickly, contagious ghost, but a healthy, well-fed young man with a slight, careful limp. When the older soldiers ask him what the Americans did to him behind the canvas walls, he simply lifts his clean uniform shirt to show them the massive, vertical surgical scar covering his stomach. He explains to the men that the enemy did not execute him or lock him away, but used an X-ray machine to find an invisible razor and cut him open to save his life. The story spreads rapidly through the camp, serving as an undeniable, physical piece of evidence that completely shatters the last remaining shreds of the German propaganda machine. He spends his days assigned to light agricultural duties, breathing the fresh air deeply and feeling the absolute, beautiful absence of the pain in his side. We are in the dusty camp yard with a fully healed survivor. Now we move forward to the end of the global conflict and the journey back to Europe. When the war in Europe officially concludes, the massive logistical process of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners back across the ocean slowly begins. Elias packs his small canvas bag, carrying a clean uniform, a few personal letters, and a profoundly changed perspective on the world. The journey back across the Atlantic is a stark contrast to the terrifying, yellow nightmare he experienced in the dark hold of the prison ship a year earlier. He stands confidently on the upper deck in the open air, feeling the cold ocean breeze against his face, standing firmly with a fully functioning liver. The Germany that Elias returns to is practically unrecognizable, with entire cities reduced to broken concrete and deep craters by years of relentless aerial bombing. Finding his family takes weeks of grueling searching through crowded displaced persons, camps, and checking hand-writ notes pinned to the wooden doors of surviving churches. When he finally reunites with his mother, she cries at the sight of the heavy, shining pink scar covering his stomach, assuming he suffered terrible torture in American captivity. He gently pulls her into a tight embrace and explains that the massive scar is not a mark of enemy cruelty, but the absolute proof of enemy compassion. We are witnessing a powerful family reunion built on a medical miracle. Finally, we look at the ultimate legacy of the boy who broke down on the table. The story of the panicking teenager on the examination table highlights a fascinating and deeply moving psychological aspect of the prisoner of war medical experience. Captives did not just arrive at the camp gates with physical combat wounds. They arrived carrying massive amounts of mental conditioning designed to make them fear their captors absolutely. The hidden shrapnel perfectly represents the silent, delayed violence of war, an injury that waited patiently for months before striking the boy down in a completely different country. The American medical staff had to act as both skilled surgeons and patient psychologists, proving their humanity through terrifyingly painful but completely necessary life-saving actions. When Elias broke down in tears on that metal table, he was shedding the thick armor of a brainwashed soldier and embracing the vulnerability of a patient who simply wanted to live. The scalpel that cut his abdomen open to remove the rusted steel also cut away the blinding hatred and fear that started the global conflict in the first place. He survived to live a long, peaceful life in a rebuilt city entirely because an American surgeon chose to stop his internal bleeding instead of looking the other way.